Thanks everyone for inviting me here. I am going to talk about life cycle assessment and begin to look at how we can think about quantifying this link between human health, between nutritional health and environmental health through life cycle assessment. We've heard this term life cycle assessment thrown around a lot already this morning, so I want to start a little bit with just looking at what life cycle assessment is. The international standards that have been developed to characterize life cycle assessment calls it the compilation and evaluation of the inputs and outputs and potential environmental impacts of a product system throughout its life cycle. I'm sure this idea of cradle to grave across the entire life cycle is probably the bit about life cycle that you've heard. But in essence, it's a methodological framework that we use to track environmental impacts for producing a product, not just in manufacturing that product, but upstream from there in extracting raw materials, transporting throughout the life cycle of the product, utilization. If we're talking about something like an automobile, this would be tailpipe emissions, and then disposal at end of life. In the most simple terms, I like to think of it as an environmental accounting tool. It's a way of tagging all those things together and giving us some end result. When we talk about inputs and outputs in life cycle assessment, we're thinking about things like raw materials, metals, minerals, water, land, as well as energy inputs into our system. On the output side, we're interested in what we typically think of as environmental pollutants, emissions to air, emissions to water, waste products. But we also need to be concerned with co-products from systems. Lots of things. We're looking at the particular product. We're looking at producing milk, but we also produce meat as a co-product, and we have to think about how to allocate the upstream burdens from producing those between two products. So a few things to keep in mind about life cycle assessment. First of all, it's a relative assessment method, and that means it's relative to some measure of what we typically, well, ideally we want it to be relative to a measure of the function of the system. That can be tricky to define, and oftentimes we don't always get there in this life cycle, but in life cycle assessment. But the important thing to remember is we're not looking at absolute emissions, we're looking at them relative to a measure of a particular product. And how we choose that functional unit, as we call it in life cycle assessment, the basis, the denominator of our assessment, has big implications for what the results show. It's especially important when we're thinking about comparing different systems that provide the same function, because we want to be able to offer that apple-to-apple comparison. Another thing, we do have these ISO standards that offer guidelines and have gone a long ways in making life cycle assessment more consistent from one study to the next. But even within those guidelines, there is no single method for conducting LCA. A lot of the methodological decisions that we make in these types of studies are dependent on the goal of the study and on what we're trying to learn. And those methodological decisions can affect results. I think it's important. That's an important thing to keep in mind because it's necessary to keep those methodological issues in mind when we think about interpretation. Lots of times they get lost when life cycle numbers are thrown around as bullet points. Tends to be data intensive. We're gathering and interconnecting and managing all of those inputs and outputs can be data intensive and time consuming. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is connect those inputs and outputs to impact categories and then quantify the environmental significance of them using impact assessment models that look at things like fade and transferred and environmental chemistry, looking at how those environmental emissions influence environmental categories. Typically what is looked at in life cycle assessment are things like energy use, global warming potential, eutrophication, which has to do with nutrient impacts in the environment, acidification, tropospheric ozone, human toxicity. Some other things that certainly are important for food and ag have tended to be less stressed in life cycle assessment because of a lot of the challenges in assessing them are things like land use, water use, biodiversity, ecotoxicity, and coming up with relevant and meaningful impact methods for some of those categories is really some of the cutting edge in life cycle assessment right now. And some of those methods we just heard about on the land use side. So how can we use life cycle assessment? It's great at identifying hotspots within our system. So we want to think about reducing impacts. Where do we focus our attention across this entire life cycle? Sometimes it's not always where we think. Also useful in evaluating unintended consequences. I want to lightweight my automobile so that I reduce fuel consumption, but the aluminum that I'm using to lightweight my automobile carries a significant environmental burden. Without this larger perspective, we lose some of those things. Same thing with avoiding burden shifting to other life cycle stages, to other environmental impacts, or to geographic regions. The comprehensive perspective is important in trying to capture some of those potential shifts. We can use life cycle assessment for comparing different products. Again, important to think about that basis for comparison, or scenarios within a particular production system. It has been used for doing things like product declaration, benchmarking, largely as a communication device to the public. And of course, it's used to inform policy. It's become a large part of sustainable consumption policy in Europe. And here in the US, the EPA is using life cycle assessment to evaluate the renewable fuel greenhouse gas threshold under the Energy Independence Act. But ultimately, it's important that to keep in mind that this is just a tool. It needs to be considered in a larger context. It's not going to tell us the answer. So I want to show some quick results, just to give you an idea of the kinds of results we can expect out of life cycle assessment. Here we're looking at the distribution of greenhouse gas emissions across the production of milk. We heard a bit earlier about milk production in the US. And the first thing that I see when I look at this is while we may be able to, squeeze out some efficiency gains through processing and transport and distribution, and at the real retail level, really the bulk of the greenhouse gas emissions are occurring here on farm. Milk production due to enteric fermentation and manure management, but also in producing the feed to feed those animals. Gives us an idea of where to focus our attention when we want to think about reductions. The other thing I want to bring to our attention here is the basis for this data happens to be per kilogram of milk consumed. So we're looking at it relative to that end user. And for me, that allows me to remember that this data includes the losses from retail and consumption. And as we've heard a number of times, those can be significant. So if we turn the data around a little bit and change that perspective, it gives us a little bit of a different story. So of course, the impacts from those losses occur throughout the life cycle because we have to produce more milk in order to consume that 1 kilogram of milk, but they're really induced by the consumer and the retail stage. If we wanted to think about changing those practices, that's where we need to look. So I put this in here because we've heard that losses across our food system can be on the order of 30 or 40%. Often it's overlooked as a potential opportunity for reducing environmental impacts. I've been impressed with the speakers this morning already, that it's come up a number of times, but often it's not something that, that is present, and a life cycle perspective helps us remember the importance of those losses. So food and agricultural systems have always been an interest and challenge to the life cycle assessment community, but there's been a particular growth of interest in recent years. And certainly this isn't an exhaustive list, but it gives us an indication of sort of the growth in studies of food and life cycle assessment. What that means is we can begin to accumulate a body of results that allows us to make comparisons between different types of food. Please don't take these numbers home and use them as the end-all answer. They're intended to just be an example, but we do start to see a distribution of, here we're looking at the carbon footprint at greenhouse gas emissions for different types of food. And general trends, the animal-based foods are at the high end here, and vegetable and fruits tend to be at the low end. A few big exceptions, out of season vegetable production in heated greenhouses carries large impact. But I'm also showing here that, again, considering the basis for our assessment and what can happen when we change that basis. It's reasonable to think about looking at foods on some measure of nutrition. If we want to think about the function of foods, we can spell that in lots of different ways, but for these types of studies, it seems like looking at a nutritional basis is important, but how do we define that? And here we can see just really quickly what happens when we consider some of those options. If we look at the difference between milk and dry beans here on a weight basis, pretty similar greenhouse gas emissions. On a gram of protein delivered basis, we're talking about a factor of 10 difference. So ideally, we would like to find a comprehensive nutritional, or a measure of a more comprehensive nutritional quality to use as that functional unit. Ultimately, though, people consume foods in combination. They consume a diversity of foods to reach their dietary needs. So maybe comparing foods one to another like this is less useful, and looking at whole dietary patterns is more relevant. Of course, because there are those differences between foods, we recognize that dietary choices matter, but what would it take to look at a whole diet? Well, conceptually, this is pretty straightforward. We need to define a diet that could be based on a national average. It could be based on dietary recommendations, could be stereotyped meals or some self-selected diets from diet intake survey. We need to link that with environmental databases, which need to be developed completely. We're starting to get there, and that linkage isn't always obvious. We have to lots of times think about proxies for foods that are missing in our environmental database and other issues that arise. But ideally, we also want to consider some measure of the nutritional components of that diet as well to use as the basis for our assessment. So we're interested in doing these kinds of studies, and the place that we've started is looking at how others have approached these types of diet-based assessment. We've found some 32 studies so far that take a life cycle approach to looking at food consumption patterns, and they all have a varying scopes and goals, so it's difficult to summarize that many studies quickly, but we can start to see some trends in approaches for these type of studies. Most of them are based on what we call process LCAs, so thinking about the stages of the food life cycle as individual processes, similar to what I just described, and then aggregating studies of individual foods into consumption patterns. The other approach to doing this kind of study would be using what's called economic input-output LCA, which takes advantage of information about the economic exchanges between sectors in an economy, and then linking those to sector-level emissions, and doing lots of matrix algebra to then tease out these connections up the life cycle. It tends to simplify the data collection, but can be very complicated in interpreting because of those sort of sector-level aggregations. Many of the studies, nearly half of the studies that we've looked at, only consider greenhouse gas emissions. And that's usually in recognizing the limitations of that we need to look at broader environmental concerns or environmental categories. Often this is driven by interest at the time, but also data availability. This is interesting, only 40% of those studies include this consumption phase, include the impact of what we would consider the use phase. So things like refrigeration in home and cooking and transportation from retail to home. We know from other estimates that those components can be significant, upwards of 20 or 30% of the total energy that goes into the U.S. food system is tied up in refrigeration and cooking. Is it important to include it in these sorts of life cycle studies? If we're considering the effects of shifts in diet, on the short term, probably not. Changing your diet's not going to probably cause you to replace your refrigerator with a smaller one. But if we're talking about longer-term policy strategies, perhaps, because we can consider some of that broader infrastructure changes. Most of the studies are coming out of the European Union. I've only seen one study in a U.S. context. And only about half of them are attempting to equalize diets on some form of nutritional basis. Otherwise, the comparisons between diets are made just on daily intake or annual intakes. Some broad trends that we see. First of all, the environmental impacts from food life cycles typically are dominated by agricultural production. We've heard that, which also means that the impacts for diet are typically dominated by agricultural production. In general, animal-based foods have greater impacts than plant-based foods across nearly all categories, the big exceptions being hothouse produced and air-shipped fruits and veggies. And if we could make a general conclusion from the 3 or 4 studies that look at current average diets versus dietary recommendations, the examples from Europe demonstrate a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions in making that shift to dietary recommendations of up to 10%. I had a few examples I wanted to go through here. I see I'm kind of running short on time. I think I'm going to step through these and talk a little bit about where future work in this area needs to go. This workshop is interested in finding this link between environmental impact and nutritional health. And from a life cycle assessment perspective, really the way to quantify that link is to establish an appropriate nutritional basis for a functional unit. We've been considering things like diet quality indices, like the Healthy Eating Index, nutrient profiling schemes. I'm sure there are other approaches out there that I would love to glean from the nutritionists in the audience, but I think this is really an area where this sort of interdisciplinary dialogue is going to be helpful. Of course, there's a great need for more data, both availability and quality. On the ag production side, we've got a good start with USDA food census or agricultural census, and the USDA LCA Digital Commons is starting to roll that into a format that's more useful for life cycle assessment. But it's also important, as we've heard a number of times, to not use generalized data for this, but to work towards regional specificity. We definitely need to expand to consider greater environmental impact categories. Just looking at greenhouse gas emissions isn't enough. Ultimately, we want to build a consistent data set of food LCA results. A few things that I didn't get a chance to touch into, water use impact, land use impact. These things have important geospatial components in assessing their environmental impact that typically, or up till this time, have not been readily included in life cycle assessment. Again, that's sort of where the cutting edge of these assessment methods are. And we also need improved ways of weighting the different environmental impact categories. If we want to make a decision about the trade-offs we're seeing between environmental impacts, ultimately this becomes a value question. Which environmental impact is more important? And developing those methods is very relevant for future LCA work. I seem to be out of time. Thanks so much.